Thank you, Greg. I'm delighted and honoured to be invited here to talk to you on farming from space. Unfortunately, I'm not a farmer, nor am I from space. But what I've done is I've taken the liberty of extending the topic that I'm going to cover from space-borne sensing right through to on-farm, tractor-mounted, or even hand-mounted sensing. And what I want to do is build up on some of what we've heard in the previous two talks. I'll be here for the whole of the meeting, so I'll be available to answer any questions that you have. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk in these 5 general areas, introduce sensors, what we can measure. I'll then move on to talk about the platforms that we have available to make the measurements, talk a little bit about the software, and just touch very briefly on a few application examples. But importantly, I want to end with a few important caveats and other conclusions. Okay, sensor technologies. There are a whole range of possible sensors based on reflectance sensing, thermal sensing, microwaves, radar, LiDAR, and fluorescence. So I'm going to start by saying something about reflectance sensing. And as part of this, I need, I'm afraid, to go through a little bit of the basic physics involved. So this is really the only science involved in this talk. You'll see in this slide, this is a reflectance spectrum from the visible region through to the infrared for, in the green line is plant material, and the bluey purple line is soil. And you'll see that the characteristic reflectance response is very different for the two. Plant material has a very low reflectance in the visible and a very high reflectance in the near infrared, while soil has a fairly smooth gradation. There's this little peak in the green, which is why plants are green. But it's this characteristic difference between visible and infrared which is the basis of much reflectance sensing. We have sensors, and many of you will be familiar with these. They're mounted on many of the nitrogen sensing systems available, which measure in the red and the near infrared. And the commonest thing to do is to calculate what's called an NDVI, a normalized difference vegetation index. And this gives us a measure of the amount of green cover, the amount of chlorophyll available in the crop, and we can then get a map showing us the amount of vegetation. So that's the basis. You're not expected to read this slide. This is just to illustrate that there are literally hundreds of such vegetation indexes which have been calculated. But I'd like to emphasize that in general, they're all measuring the same thing, the amount of green material in the image. There are, however, a number of other vegetation indices, and one class of those are what are called water content indices of various sorts, which are based on measurements in these water absorption bands in the mid-infrared. I'm sorry for you at this side of the audience, but I've only got one pointer. Okay, just a brief summary. We can get information on crop canopy cover remotely from vegetation indices, the conventional vegetation indices I've mentioned. We can get it from RGB cameras. We don't need the characteristic vegetation indices to get information. Simple cameras can often be as good from remote sensing perspective. We've also talked about water indices, the mid-infrared indices. Although they give a measure of canopy water content, they are unfortunately, at the present state of development, really rather imprecise. So to date, we can't put too much reliability on them. There's been a lot of work in the last few years on the development of so-called hyperspectral indices. This is making use of very fine differences in the spectral reflectance dependent on various biochemicals in the crop canopy. We can pick up nutrient status, we can pick up aspects of various other pigments, we can estimate soluble carbohydrate in the canopy even, and we can diagnose different stresses. And I'll try and talk a little bit about that if I have time. And then we can also get information from multi-angular views from the camera. This gives us some information on canopy structure. I won't have time to talk about that, but I'm happy to answer questions later. Okay, moving on to a topic that I've done a lot of work on personally, and this is the use of thermal imaging, thermal infrared, as a stress diagnostic, and particularly for studying evaporation and water stress. Basically, thermal sensors detect the amount of evaporation. High temperatures relate to non-transpiring crops. Low temperatures indicate rapid transpiration, open stomata. Of course, there's a problem that the temperature itself depends on lots of other things, radiation, environmental temperature, and so on. So absolute temperature is not very useful. We need some means of calibrating thermal data, and there's been a lot of research in the last few years on ways of calibrating thermal data using either meteorological data or physical references. So, as I said, temperature is primarily a measure of water use when normalized, and hence is a good indicator of drought stress and particularly stomatal closure. And it's widely used in remote sensing technologies, both at the regional scale from satellite data, at the crop scale from both airborne, satellite, and local information for irrigation scheduling, and at the individual plot scale. For example, it's being now used in plant breeding. And as I say, we can apply thermal data at any scale that we need, from satellite right through to individual crops, plots. We can carry, colleague, this is Brian. Whoops, what's happened here? That goes very quickly. I leave my finger on the button and it just flips through. What I meant to point out was this is a colleague, Brian Lovey's, using a thermal sensor in a vineyard in collaboration with Oxford Landing to schedule irrigation there. The three final types of sensor I don't really have time to talk about in detail. I'll mention a couple of them later. Microwave information, that's radar. We can get information on soil moisture And there are satellite sensors which provide soil moisture information. LiDAR is the light equivalent of radar, and this provides us very good information on canopy structure, particularly when used on in-field sensors. And we can also sense fluorescence by using novel fluorescence sensing technology called LIFT. But that's very much in the development stage. Okay, moving on to the platforms. As we've seen, these stretch right from satellite, right through airborne, balloons, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, unmanned ground vehicles, that's autonomous robots, or manned ground vehicles. And although I won't be talking about it, but I think they're equally important, are wireless sensor networks of sensors distributed through farms and paddocks. But the critical thing for all of us is which of these are the ones we need to use, and we have a number of considerations we've got to take account of. First, and probably most important, is cost. Secondly, and equally important really, is timeliness. When is the information available? Is it when we need it to do the responses that we need to make? And also, in the same context, how frequently is it available? Some satellites, such as Landsat, pass only every 15 days. And if that coincides with a cloud event, we can't get the data for 30 days. So some satellite data is too infrequent to be of use for many management purposes. Spatial resolution is another important question. Some satellites give us data every 10 to 15 minutes, but at a 5 to 6 or 7 kilometer pixel size. So the resolution is extremely low. Again, no use for local farm management. Other satellites may give much higher spatial resolution, down to a meter or so, but often costs you. And of course, there is the labor requirement for actually analyzing the data. To use it, it needs to be readily available and easily handled. There's often a trade-off between frequency of availability and the spatial resolution. Just to illustrate, the meteorological satellites we use in Australia, for example, has a 5 kilometer spatial resolution, while you can get very high resolution from Worldview 2 or Iconos or QuickBird, the image on the left, the one on the left, but generally costly. Moving down a scale to airborne, many people are already using airborne sensors for various purposes. There's a heavy requirement for this, for handling the images, relating them to the crop on the ground, but the software is rapidly becoming available to automate this geolocation of the image. And this is a result from colleagues in CSIRO's study and one of their experimental farms, showing that you can get a wonderful thermal map covering the area of the experiment. Another approach that has been used, this is work with Ashley Wheaton, is to mount the cameras on a balloon. And here's some images, or this is an image from the Oxford Landing experiment I mentioned. Different irrigation amounts applied. We can see the different temperatures of each of the irrigation plots. And this was readily picked up from the balloon measurements. I know many of you are interested in possibilities of using these UAVs, octocopters, or other drone-type systems. Software is now being available to to synthesize a crop image, as we see from this example. Moving down a scale, it's also interesting to do this within the field. This is primarily a research tool at this stage, used by the plant breeders, for example, screening plots, either with the handheld, hand-pushed, simple devices, the top left-hand corner, tractor-mounted ones, or systems mounted on autonomous robots. And there's a lot of work in Germany on the development of autonomous robots for this activity. I just thought I'd illustrate the developments in this field with the Canberra, what they call the Phenomobile, which is being designed as a mount for a wide range of sensors to get all the information that the crop breeders need from their cereal crops. It has visible, it has hyperspectral measurements, it has thermal, and importantly, it has LiDAR. And we can get lovely 3D pictures of the crop, gives us all the information a breeder would need to select for density of crop, leaf angle, things like that. It has the thermal to detect, to screen for stomatal behavior, and spectral information. And just to illustrate, here's a brief video showing, hopefully, the Phenomobile in action and producing almost real-time LiDAR images of crop structure. And the breeders are able to use this to select the characteristic genotypes from the crop that they need. Okay, so just a few words on platform comparison. Satellite, probably the greatest difficulty with satellites are that they are limited by clouds. In West Australia, you're better off than we are in the UK, but even here, clouds will limit the usefulness of satellite images, except for radar satellites. In general, you have either very low spatial resolution. The most common satellites that fly over daily, Terra and Aqua with MODIS sensors, they have 1 kilometer spatial resolution. So you can't really pick up individual paddocks with such systems. Satellite is very good for weather information, and it's extremely good for mapping information. One can use a fairly high-resolution satellite like Landsat and get good mapping information. It's much less useful because of the trade-off between frequency and pixel size for short-term crop management. Airborne is below cloud, so it's more widely usable. Potentially high frequency, high resolution, so we can get good crop data. Balloons, I would actually rule out as a practical tool. They're usually limited by wind. UAVs are potentially tremendously exciting, but I say potentially. They're high resolution, very flexible in their deployment, low cost in general, but they have a very low payload, so the sorts of cameras you can mount on them are limited. They have a small, short flight time, the currently available, certainly the cheaper ones. They're not very robust, so one doesn't want to put a very expensive camera on many of these. It might break. And then tractor-mounted ones, I think, have tremendous advantages. We've heard a bit about the sort of opportunities here in the previous two talks, because they can be incorporated into on-farm management. So I rule out balloons, but the others all have their uses. Just a couple of words on software. Software is critical for handling remote sensing data, and we need the sorts of systems that I think the two previous speakers were talking about for incorporating satellite data or other remote sensing data into farm management systems. And one familiar system, which is, I think, very similar to what we've been hearing about, is what I've been working with in the UK, is this system where you can incorporate all different types of information into one system: soil mapping, yield mapping, remote sensing data, monitoring data, and so on, and usable in-field on tablets or iPhones or whatever. And this is the system produced by Soil Essentials, but there are lots of others. Just a few words on applications. How are we doing? Weather satellites are central to current information technology and information gathering. The weather forecasts are entirely dependent on weather satellites. We also have radar for studying rainfall distribution. Of course, the weather satellites that are available only produce images can produce images every 10 minutes, but at this 5-kilometer spatial resolution. There are systems available, and many of you will be familiar with the system that we have available in WA, FrostWatch, which uses data from NOAA AVHRR satellite, 1 kilometer spatial resolution, but gives us temperature distributions daily and can be provided. Some other examples. I mentioned that satellites are very suitable, the higher resolution ones, for crop mapping. But because they're low frequency, they are most useful for simply giving mapping information. And in fact, it's been incorporated in many countries in effectively government-based systems, Big Brother, you might say, to know who is growing what and where. But it can be used for more detailed information of direct use to the grower, for biomass estimation during the season, yield forecasts. We can use satellite data for crop phenology, for checking how crops are developing. But as we come down in scales, probably to airborne or drone-type operations, we can develop much more precise information on vigour, crop vigour, stress management, and applications to the precision agriculture and variable rate application technology. And weed detection, things like that, fertilizer detection, and simply soil mapping. This is just an illustration, not for a grain crop, but in a natural vegetation. We can identify the different crop species. We can even do this within agricultural crops, compare sorghum, maize, wheat, and so on. Yield prediction. In many cases, there's useful yield prediction from vegetation indices. I mentioned previously that there are now developments. We think it's possible to detect the amount of soluble stem carbohydrate from spectral properties. This is some work from Queensland. Stress diagnosis. Certainly we can detect nitrogen stress and other nutrient deficiencies. We can detect water stress using thermal imagery. I'm not quite sure what that stress is. Okay, if I have a couple of minutes, I'll talk about stress diagnosis. Unfortunately, most stresses many stresses produce similar symptoms. Stomatal closure happens with drought, waterlogging, frost, all sorts of things. So we have a range of sensors which measure temperature, spectral reflectance, photosynthesis, canopy structure. Each of these measures a particular response: stomata, pigments, biochemistry, canopy structure. And these relate to specific stresses. And if we look at this, temperature relates to a whole range of different abiotic and biotic stresses. Spectral reflectance changes with different stresses. Photosynthesis and chlorophyll fluorescence changes with different stresses. And canopy structure changes. But the real advantage, if we have multiple sensors, we can actually then pick up a characteristic response pattern for different stresses. Precision agriculture we've heard a bit about. Weed management, the same thing. Lots of opportunities here. So I just want to finish now with a few slides on some caveats and some conclusions. I've talked a lot about different scale and different resolution. The information we get depends on the scale of the sensor. This is a very famous painting by Salvador Dali of his wife, contemplating the Mediterranean Sea. I'm not sure how well at the back you can see the painting, but at the front at least you should be able to see the details of his wife. If, however, you blur this, or you take your glasses off, the picture changes completely. It becomes now a portrait of Abraham Lincoln. And this illustrates that the sort of information you get at different scales is different. And one needs to target the scale of your observation to the information that you want. Another example of the problems of scale is illustrated in this picture. If we imagine a fairly large pixel of tens of meters, the right-hand image here, that's a mixture of crop and soil. So the average temperature we're picking up is a mixture of the two. But for crop management, for irrigation, we're interested in the canopy temperature. And you need to go to smaller and smaller pixels, finding that the actual canopy temperature is much smaller than that of the average in the area. And this is a real problem with remote sensing where the pixels have mixed information. So all is not easy. There are ways of getting around this, but they're a challenge. Also, many of you will be familiar with crop nitrogen estimation by the various commercial sensors available. There's nearly always a good relationship between measured vegetation index and predicted nitrogen content, but there's there's an important scatter in the graph. And if you try and invert a single measurement of vegetation index, you find that the actual estimated nitrogen content can be anything over quite a wide range for an individual NDVI. It's rather imprecise, this inversion, which means there's a lot of need for local calibration. So, to conclude, I think there's tremendous potential at all the scales I've talked about. But I think particularly at the tractor-mounted and the drone scales. As I've suggested, we need to be very aware of spurious accuracy and the need to calibrate specifically. And the real way forward is going to be dependent on software developments of integrating this data. But I would say that a lot of what we're talking about is still at the development stage. I know there are many people who are involved at various aspects of this development, but it still has some way to go before it's, I think, we would call a developed technology. And if you're interested in any further information, apologize for my advertising, but 2 texts I've produced on aspects of this. Thank you very much.
Pardon me, Bill Bowden, retired or retarded, depending on how you want to address it. I was just interested, for Dr. Jones, on relativities versus absolutes. Most of your sensing is very good at picking up differences between things, but when it comes to having workable systems, one has to come back to real numbers, and when you start putting relativities of real numbers from a lot of situations together, you find that there's a hell of a big variability. Would it be good from a management point of view that people put control strips of different things in so that the relativities then have some local absolute scaling?
Yes. As I mentioned in the talk, many of the systems that we're doing are providing an absolute measure, but that depends on environmental conditions and all sorts of things. For thermal sensing, we have now quite good technologies available for converting the measurement of temperature we get to a useful absolute measure of stress, for example. But it nearly always requires a ground-based reference of some sort. That ground-based reference can either be information obtained from a local meteorological station, that gives you enough information to correct for environmental variation, or, as in quite a lot of our work, we actually use a physical reference of what a temperature of a non-transpiring crop might be. For some of the other sensors, nitrogen, for example, that problem is less substantial, though there is still a need for an absolute local calibration in most cases.